One of the most haunting pieces that I've read about the lives and the inner lives of soldiers was a short story called The Things They Carried. It's by Tim O'Brien. It begins with a scene of the young First Lieutenant Jimmy Cross, who carries letters from Martha. The whole story unfolds and is told through the things that Jimmy and his platoon carried through Vietnam. In the late afternoon, O'Brien tells us, after a day's march, Jimmy would dig his foxhole, wash his hands under a canteen, unwrap the letters, hold them with the tips of his fingers, and spend the last hour of light pretending. Even as a child of the digital age, I have folded up letters, little notes, carried them around with me. Something so tender, so sweet about this relationship to a simple, fleeting thing. And such a jarring contrast with that war that Jimmy is fighting. The letters, we discover, weigh 10 ounces. The first weight in a long litany of all the things they carried. The same weight as a single round for the M79 grenade launcher. As O'Brien tells these soldiers' stories, which are also his own stories as a Vietnam vet, as he tells the tale of the weights of the things they carried interspersed with episodes of horrific violence, of soldiers dying, of soldiers casually murdering civilians. As the tale unfolds, Martha's love letters seem more and more out of place at the bottom of Jimmy's rucksack. Near the end of the story, Jimmy decides he can't keep bringing her to that place, not even in his imagination. O'Brien writes, briefly in the rain, Lieutenant Cross saw Martha's gray eyes gazing back at him. He understood. It was very sad, he thought. The things men carried inside. The things men did or felt they had to do. And so he decides he would dispense with love. It was not now a factor. And if anyone quarreled or complained, he would simply tighten his lips and arrange his shoulders in the correct command posture. He might give a curt little nod, or he might not. He might just shrug and say, "Carry on." What things do you carry? I've been so moved these last weeks seeing the whole community here transform into the field of red poppies. I can't think of any public ritual in the States that has such beauty and grace and poignancy to it. I was talking with my mom, and she said when she was a kid, we still wore the red poppies, but since it became Veterans Day, no longer. 100 years later, and the dead of Flanders Field are still carried with us, still speak through simple poppies pinned to jackets, shirts, and scarves. I was particularly struck by the range of people I saw at the remembrance ceremony that I went to on Friday. This truly is a community ritual. Even young folks with ripped up jeans and tattoos and piercings, proudly wearing those poppies. The ritual has made me think of a quote from the British writer G.K. Chesterfield. He said, "Tradition means giving votes to the most obscure of all classes, the dead. It is the democracy of our ancestors. Tradition refuses to submit to that arrogant oligarchy who merely happen to be walking around. Listen more often to things than to beings. Those who have died have never left. The dead are not under the earth." They're in the rustling trees, the groaning woods, in the crying grass, in the moaning rocks. Listen more often to things than to beings. However you understand death, those words point us to this undeniable truth that those who have died have a presence still in this world, if only through metaphor and memory. My grandfather's ashes were scattered in the Pacific Ocean, and it will always be a place to visit him. Crashing oceans, rustling leaves, groaning woods, crying grass, moaning rocks, and also pinned poppies, and silent cenotaphs, and boxes of letters. All these ritual objects that carry the voice of the dead. They bring us into what mystics from traditions from around the world have called the cave of the heart. That place where the chatter of the present day quiets a bit. Where we can hear the softer voices of the world that do not speak in words. A cave of the heart is the place where we can listen more often to things than to beings. Memorial sculptures, scattered all over the planet, everywhere where people live, also become such invitations to the cave of the heart. Emily and I, a couple of years ago, had the opportunity to visit Budapest. And there on the bank of the river Danube, right there in the heart of the city of Budapest, there are cast bronze shoes lined up along the water. As we first approached, their realism made me think that a few dozen people must have just jumped into the river. As we came closer, we began to realize a different meaning as throughout the shoes were scattered candles and flowers. The shoes are there to remember the citizens of Budapest, many Jewish, who were killed by the fascist Arrow Cross militia during World War II. The victims were brought to the edge of the river, told to take off their shoes, along with anything else of value, before they were shot right into the river. Often it is not a feel-good task, this listening to the dead. When I think about those shoes and the precious lost lives that wore them, I also think about the men and women who committed those atrocious acts, really mostly men. The soldiers who murdered innocent people because of their religion or ethnicity or political beliefs or sexuality. I don't know much about them or their lives, but this is what I know. I know that I can't say that with their life experience, living in their context, standing in their soldiers' shoes, I wouldn't have become the same monster myself. And I know that however they justified or rationalized the atrocities, those soldiers and all who have been asked to kill, even for a cause that they believed was just, must reckon in one way or another with the weight of those actions. After the war, Lieutenant Jimmy Cross must find a way back to softening the shoulders, a way back to living in this world that is also full of tenderness, of kind and caring faces, of fragile love letters and red poppies. There's been a lot of work done in recent years on the subject of moral injury. Moral injury is the idea of an injury to one's moral conscience, of extensive emotional shame as a result of transgression, real or perceived, of one's own moral code. And what the social workers and theologians and psychologists who are working in this field have found is that moral injury can and usually does occur when soldiers participate in killing other humans, even when they believe their actions are justified. Participating in war leaves lasting psychological and spiritual impact that must be addressed not only by the individual but by the culture that they return to. In many societies throughout history, soldiers returning from war had to engage through some kind of purification ritual before they could come back into their families, their community. These practices of purification and repentance were required even for the sanctioned actions of what was deemed a just war, because the society would expect that warriors would nevertheless feel shame and guilt. In some European medieval countries, the civilians would even share in these rituals, mourning and acknowledging that shared responsibility for the actions of returning soldiers. Perhaps not so different from the intention of remembrance ceremonies, but such a contrast from much of the hero worship, the celebratory parades that lift up returning soldiers, but do not acknowledge the moral injuries that they may have suffered. So I think that there's some hope in the beauty of the field of poppies, some hope in these symbols that remind us that the broken places are so often the same places where the most brilliant light shines through. Some hope in acknowledging the weight of war, even for those of us committed to waging peace, and doing our part still to carry the moral weight. There's a story from the Hebrew Bible that comes to mind for me. It's about Joseph. Really, it's about Joseph's bones. Do you know the story of Joseph? He was the youngest brother in that big family. And to make a long story short, his siblings, they sold him into slavery, where he became an important vizier down in Egypt, and eventually reconciled with his family, and then ended up supporting them through hard times. And then finally, as he prepared to die at the ripe old age of 110, patriarch of Israelites in exile. But before he died, he made the children of Israel swear that when they left the land of Egypt, they would take his bones with them. And so fast forward a couple hundred years, and there was Moses confronting Pharaoh for the umpteenth time, preparing the Israelites to flee Egypt. You know this story. It was all such a rush. No time to let the bread rise. Take only what you can carry on your back. Leave before Pharaoh has a chance to change his mind again. And in all this haste, the story goes, this ancient oath to Joseph was so important that Moses himself took the time to collect Joseph's bones so the people could carry them back to Israel. What bones do you carry? I mentioned my grandfather earlier. I never met him. I never met my grandfather, but I have a dark, heavy black cloak of his and a beautiful silver ring. And I know that I carry his bones. He was a Presbyterian minister. He served as a chaplain in the Air Force, the Army Air Force as it was then in World War II. He taught homiletics, preaching in a couple of seminaries. He was married and had 4 daughters. One of his students told me once that he towered in the pulpit. This week marks the anniversary of his death, marks the anniversary of his murder. He was murdered because in addition to being a chaplain and a pastor and a preacher and a teacher and a husband and a father, he was gay. And a young man who himself was struggling with mental health and his own sexuality, it sounds like, picked up my grandfather in a gay bar and killed him, as he had other gay men as well. And the impact of that night rippled across generations of my family. We've carried his bones, my family. And the weight of his silence, the silence around his sexuality. His wife, my grandmother, she couldn't talk about it through her dying day. has probably been the heaviest bone of all. But we've also carried his bones with pride. When my lesbian mom's marriage was legally recognized 23 years after their commitment ceremony, 30 years after my grandfather was killed, it was an honor to carry those bones into a world that he would not have dreamed was possible. These words from the Unitarian minister Kathy McTeague. In the struggles we choose for ourselves, in the ways we move forward in our lives and bring our world forward with us, it is right to remember the names of those who gave us strength in this choice of living. It is right to name the power of hard lives well lived. We share a history with those lives. We belong to the same motion. They too were strengthened by what had gone before. They too were drawn on by the vision of what might come to be. Those who lived before us, who struggled for justice and suffered injustice before us, have not melted into the dust, have not disappeared. They are with us still. Their lives hold us steady. Their words remind us and call us back to ourselves. Their courage and love evoke our own. We, the living, carry them with us. We are their voices, their hands, and their hearts. We take them with us and choose the deeper path of living. And I know that for many of us, that deeper path of living might feel just a bit harder this week than it did last. The future might seem just a little bit more precarious. So, as the last leaves fall, as we move steadily towards that darkest, longest night, may we be guided back to the cave of the heart. May we hold with gentle fingertips the fragile letters of our lives that remind us that even in the hardest time, love and beauty and tender kindness remain. May the bones that we carry connect us to all those who have struggled before us to bring peace and justice into our world. May it be so. The last word to the poet, the sage who reached across generations, who spoke to the ages. This is Leonard Cohen from Anthem. The birds, they sang at the break of day. Start again, I heard them say. Don't dwell on what has passed away or what is yet to be. Ah, the wars, they will be fought again. The holy dove, she will be caught again. Bought and sold and bought again, the dove is never free. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. That's how the light gets in. That is how the light gets in. May it be so. Amen.